There is a road sign at the edge of a town in Pennsylvania that reads, Centralia, population 0. The sign is technically accurate. The borough of Centralia was incorporated in 1866. It had churches, schools, a post office, a hotel, bars, a volunteer fire company, a minor league baseball team. At its peak, it had over 1,000 people living in it. The zip code was 17927. In 1992, the United States Postal Service revoked that zip code. It no longer exists in any federal database. The town is still there. The buildings that weren't demolished are still standing. Some of them are occupied. Beneath them, a coal seam has been on fire since 1962. It is still burning. This is not a story about a disaster. Disasters are sudden. They have a moment of rupture, a body count, a press conference, a memorial. This is a story about something slower, about how a government looks at a problem, calculates what solving it would cost, looks at the people living inside the problem, and chooses a different kind of solution. The solution was not to put out the fire. The solution was to remove the town. This is not a story about the fire. This is a story about the forgetting. Centralia sits in Columbia County in east-central Pennsylvania, in the valley of the Locust Creek watershed, surrounded by ridges that were, for about 100 years, among the most economically important hills in North America. The reason was anthracite coal, hard coal, not the soft bituminous coal of West Virginia and Kentucky, but the compressed, dense, slow-burning anthracite that the geological history of the Appalachian Range produced in this specific corridor of Pennsylvania. Anthracite burns hotter and longer than other coal. It burns cleaner, less smoke, less soot. Through the late 19th century and the early 20th, it was the dominant fuel for home heating across the American Northeast. It ran the furnaces of New York City apartment buildings and the steam heat of Boston brownstones. The men who dug it out of the ground in Columbia and Schuylkill and Northumberland counties were predominantly immigrants, Irish, Welsh, Eastern European, Italian, who came in waves corresponding to the labor demands of the mining companies and settled in towns that were built specifically to house a workforce. Centralia was one of those towns. It was founded as a company settlement in the 1850s, grew into an incorporated borough by the 1860s, and by the early 20th century had all the institutional density of a functioning small American community. Catholic churches serving several different immigrant parishes, Protestant churches, a theatre, a library, fraternal organizations, a high school with its own athletic teams. The mine shafts beneath and around the town were dug in the 1850s and expanded across the following century. By the time the fire started, the coal seams directly accessible from Centralia had largely been worked out. The mining industry in the region had been contracting for decades. Cheaper oil and gas were displacing anthracite for home heating. The most accessible seams were exhausted. Mechanization had reduced the labor needed even for what production remained. The town was already in economic decline when the fire started. The population had been falling since the 1920s. Businesses had been closing. Young people were leaving and not coming back. The tax base had eroded to the point where the borough struggled to maintain the infrastructure built for a population 3 times its current size. Centralia was, in 1962, a small, struggling, rural Pennsylvania town that had lost its economic reason for existing and was working through the slow arithmetic of that loss. This context matters. A declining extraction town in a rural county with a shrinking voter base occupies a different position in the attention of state and federal government than a prosperous suburb or a politically significant city. Centralia had no particular leverage. Its residents were working class, many of them elderly, many of them with deep roots in the community, but limited mobility and limited resources. When they made noise about the fire, they were making noise from a position of institutional weakness. That is relevant to everything that followed. On May 27, 1962, the Centralia Town Council authorized the volunteer fire company to clean out the Oddfellows Cemetery dump site, an old strip mine pit at the edge of town that had been used for years as a municipal landfill and was coming up for a health inspection before Memorial Day weekend. The method the fire company used was the standard method used by municipal waste operations across thousands of American communities at the time: controlled burning. They lit the trash to reduce its volume. The fire reached an exposed vein of coal in the pit. The precise mechanism remains a point of contention in the historical record. Some accounts conclude that the pit had been inadequately sealed after a fire in 1932, leaving an open connection between the surface dump and the mine workings below, and that the 1962 burn found that connection. Other accounts conclude that the burn simply reached a coal exposure that prior burns had not. The official story offered by various agencies shifted across the years that followed, which is itself a data point. What is not disputed is what happened after the fire reached the coal. It went underground. Once it entered the network of anthracite mine shafts and passages beneath Centralia, tunnels, air shafts, horizontal adits, interconnected chambers, passages stretching for miles in multiple directions beneath the borough and the surrounding ridges, it had everything it required to persist indefinitely. Coal, oxygen, moving through the ventilation systems that the mining companies had built into the workings to protect their workers. Space, following the geometry of extraction that a century of mining had carved into the subsurface, and the specific property of anthracite coal, which is that once it achieves ignition temperature, it does not require high heat to sustain itself. It smoulders. It spreads along seams and through fractured strata at rates measured in feet per month or feet per year, following the underground pathways that exist on maps that are never entirely complete because miners mapped what they accessed and not everything they accessed was mapped. Initial attempts to suppress the fire began within weeks. Workers tried flushing water into the burning pit area. They excavated trenches to cut off the fire's forward spread. They attempted to pump slurry, water mixed with sand and fly ash, into the accessible sections of the fire zone. The trenches failed because the fire had already entered passages below the trench depth. The slurry injections treated sections of the fire area that were accessible while the fire continued moving in directions that were not. By the end of 1962, the Bureau of Mines, the federal agency responsible for mine safety and mine-related hazards, had concluded that the fire was established in the underground mine workings and that the surface suppression measures were not adequate to address it. The Bureau proposed a comprehensive solution: open-cut excavation. The burning coal seam and the surrounding material would be stripped out ahead of the fire's advancing edge, removing the fuel before the fire could reach it. This was not an untested approach. It had been used successfully on other coal mine fires in Pennsylvania. It was disruptive, expensive, and required heavy equipment and significant earth moving. The estimated cost in the early 1960s, when the fire was still relatively contained, was in the range of several $100,000. There is a secondary problem with the mine workings beneath Centralia that made suppression harder and the fire's spread harder to track. The maps were incomplete. The coal companies that had operated in the area through the 19th and early 20th centuries were not required, under the regulations of those eras, to produce standardized, comprehensive surveys of their workings. Some companies mapped their operations in detail. Others mapped selectively, recording the main passages and the productive seams, while leaving secondary tunnels, old air shafts, and abandoned sections unrecorded, or recorded only in documents that were held by the companies and not consistently transferred to government archives when the operations closed. When the mines around Centralia were abandoned as the industry contracted, the documentation that existed was fragmented across multiple defunct companies, partial government filings, and records that were in private hands or simply lost. The engineers trying to track the Centralia fire were working against this incomplete picture from the beginning. They could measure surface temperature anomalies. They could drill monitoring boreholes to sample underground gases and temperatures. They could use the available mine maps to infer likely spread paths. But they could not see the whole connected system. The fire was moving through passages that were, in some cases, not on any map that any agency possessed. Each new assessment found it had spread into areas that prior assessments had not predicted, in part because those areas were not known to be connected to the areas being monitored. The funding allocated for early suppression efforts fell short of what engineers said was required. The 1963 remediation effort was partial. The subsequent efforts through the late 1960s were partial. In 1969, a more substantial effort was mounted, but again the funds available were below what a complete excavation solution required. The fire continued to spread. By 1977, the most serious pre-relocation suppression attempt was authorized. The Office of Surface Mining, which had by then taken over jurisdiction, allocated approximately $3.3 million for work in Centralia. The engineers overseeing the project stated, before work began, that $3.3 million was insufficient to stop the fire. It might slow the spread in one section, but the fire had expanded to the point where comprehensive excavation would cost far more. The work proceeded anyway. The fire was not stopped. When the project concluded, the fire continued expanding in sections that the excavation had not reached. The residents of Centralia knew some of this. They did not know all of it, and what they were told officially did not always match what the internal agency assessments showed. Through the late 1960s and 1970s, the evidence of the underground fire accumulated at the surface. In areas directly above active burning sections, the ground was warm. Sinkholes opened without warning in backyards and along road shoulders as subsurface material burned away and the ground above it collapsed. Vegetation died in irregular patches that corresponded to underground heat zones. In winter, snow melted and stayed melted in certain areas of town, while the surrounding streets stayed covered. And in the lower levels of houses, basements, ground floor rooms with poor ventilation, carbon monoxide and other combustion gases from the burning seams migrated upward through cracked and fractured ground. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. People experiencing carbon monoxide exposure do not smell it. They develop headaches, persistent, unexplained headaches. They feel nauseous without a food-related cause. They feel fatigued in ways that rest does not resolve. These are the symptoms that residents in affected areas of Centralia began reporting to their doctors, and then to the state health department, and then to their elected representatives through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The symptoms were not dramatic. They were chronic, diffuse, and could be attributed to many causes. They were not the kind of symptom cluster that generates emergency response. They were the kind of symptom cluster that generates a study. Studies were conducted. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources monitored carbon monoxide levels in the borough periodically. The results of these monitoring efforts were not uniformly and completely shared with the residents whose homes were being tested. Some readings that exceeded safe thresholds were communicated to individual homeowners. Others were filed in departmental records. The public communications from state officials through this period consistently used language indicating that the situation was being monitored, that no evacuation level danger had been confirmed, and that remediation efforts were ongoing. A resident named Joan Girolami became a central figure in the community's effort to force more complete disclosure and more decisive action. She began systematically collecting health complaint data from her neighbors, documenting patterns of illness and demanding access to monitoring results and engineering assessments from state and federal agencies. She attended public meetings. She wrote letters to the governor's office, to congressional representatives, to the EPA. She organized Centralia residents into a more coherent advocacy body. She was not alone. There were others who made similar efforts, whose names appear less frequently in the public record, but she became the most persistent and visible voice of the residents who believed they were not being told everything, and that the fire beneath their town was more dangerous than they were being officially told it was. The official responses she received were consistent. Acknowledgements of the fire, assurances of monitoring, commitments to further study, and representations that the situation did not require immediate drastic action. Each of these responses was, in a narrow technical sense, defensible, based on the most recently completed assessment. None of them addressed the pattern. The gap between what was known, what was funded, and what was communicated to the people living above the problem. In 1979, residents in a neighborhood directly above an actively burning section of the mine workings measured carbon monoxide in their own homes using equipment they had obtained independently. The readings were elevated above safe thresholds. They brought these readings to state officials. The state conducted its own measurements, confirmed elevated levels, and recommended that the affected homeowners install carbon monoxide detectors. The residents were not told to evacuate. The fire that was producing the carbon monoxide was not extinguished. The detectors were installed in houses over a burning coal seam. On February 14, 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was in his grandmother's backyard on East Park Street in Centralia. The ground opened beneath him. He fell into a sinkhole approximately 4 feet across and 60 feet deep. At the bottom, the sinkhole was venting carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide at concentrations that were lethal within minutes. He grabbed a root protruding from the wall of the hole. He held on. His 14-year-old cousin Eric had been nearby and heard him shout. Eric grabbed Todd's arms and pulled him out. Todd Domboski was not seriously injured. He was 12 years old. The sinkhole was in the backyard of a residential property on a residential street in the middle of a borough where children had been playing outside their whole lives. The tree root was not engineered. It was there. Within 48 hours, television cameras were in Centralia. National news networks ran the story. The image, a child nearly swallowed by the earth in a Pennsylvania town, while an underground fire burned beneath it, had the visual clarity and human immediacy that 2 decades of monitoring reports, health complaints, petitions, and community meetings had not produced in the national press. Congressional members issued statements. Governor Richard Thornburgh declared a state of emergency. Federal agencies that had not previously characterized the situation as a crisis began using crisis language. The shift in tone from official sources between the period before February 14, 1981, and the period after it was sharp. Before, monitoring, study, remediation, ongoing assessment. After, emergency, relocation, federal resources, decisive action. The physical situation beneath Centralia had not changed dramatically between January and February 1981. The fire had been spreading for 19 years. The carbon monoxide had been accumulating in basements for years. The sinkholes had been opening for years. Todd Domboski's was not the first. What changed was that the story now had a 12-year-old and a 60-foot hole and a news cycle that would not drop it. Joan Girolami and the other residents who had been pressing for action for years watched this process. They had been accurate. The fire was dangerous. The monitoring had confirmed danger that was not being acted upon. The health complaints were real and documented. The assessments had consistently found more extensive underground burning than prior assessments had found. They had been right about all of it for 20 years, and the response had been study and monitoring and partial measures. A child nearly died in a backyard, and the response was a federal emergency declaration. By 1984, Congress had allocated approximately $42 million for a voluntary relocation program. Residents who accepted buyouts received assessments of fair market value for their properties. Those who accepted relocated to neighboring towns, to other parts of Pennsylvania, to wherever they chose to go. Their houses were demolished. By 1986, the large majority of Centralia's remaining population had accepted the buyout. Block by block, the borough emptied. Lots where houses had stood for 100 years became patches of grass, and then scrub brush, and then more aggressive vegetation. The $42 million spent on relocation is worth examining against the earlier figures. The comprehensive excavation cost estimates from the early 1960s, when the fire was most contained and a complete solution was most tractable, ran between several $100,000 and several $1 million, depending on which study and which scope. By the mid-1970s, as the fire had spread, estimates ranged up to tens of millions. By the time full excavation was assessed in the late 1970s and early 1980s, engineers had mapped the fire extensively enough to price a complete solution at several $100 million. But this was because the fire had been spreading, unchecked, for 15 to 20 years, while partial measures were funded instead of comprehensive ones. The relocation cost of $42 million did not resolve the fire. It removed the witnesses. The fire continued exactly as it had been continuing. It continues today. A portion of Centralia's residents refused the buyout. The number who refused was never large. At its peak in the mid-1980s, perhaps 20 or 30 households, and that number declined over subsequent years as some changed their minds or died and their heirs accepted settlements. But a core group held on, and their reasons, when documented in interviews and court filings over the following decades, are worth examining without the condescension of the word stubborn. Among the most documented of the holdouts was a man named John Lokitis Jr., who had grown up in Centralia and whose family had been in the borough for generations. He ran one of the last remaining businesses and had been vocal in the organized resident advocacy through the 1970s. He knew the record as well as anyone, had attended the meetings, read the assessments he could obtain, watched the funding cycles produce partial solutions that engineers characterized as inadequate. When the relocation offer came, he did not take it. He lived in Centralia as the houses around him were bought and demolished one by one. He watched the population fall from several hundred to fewer than 50, to fewer than 20. He remained. His reasons, in the interviews he gave over the years, had a consistent character. This was where he was from, and the government that was asking him to leave had not earned the trust required to accept its characterization of why leaving was necessary. Some did not trust the government's assessment of the danger. This is a rational position for a resident of Centralia to hold in 1984, given the record. The same agencies that were now saying the situation required immediate evacuation had been saying for 2 decades that the situation was being managed. The same government that now characterized the town as uninhabitable had funded partial measures that engineers said were insufficient and presented them to residents as progress. A person who had watched that process unfold over 20 years could reasonably conclude that the current assessment, like the prior ones, reflected what the government needed to say at a given moment rather than a complete and transparent accounting of the facts. Some believed the buyout prices were below the actual value of their properties or below what they were entitled to under eminent domain principles. The fair market value of a property in a declining coal town above an underground fire is difficult to establish with precision, and some residents believed the assessments systematically undervalued what they had built. Some had lived in Centralia for 60 or 70 years. Their parents were buried in the church cemetery. Their social world, to the extent that it still existed, was in Centralia. An offer of money and a relocation was not equivalent to having a place to be from. This is not sentiment in the dismissive sense. It is a description of something real that the relocation program did not and could not compensate for. In 1992, Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain and condemned all remaining properties in Centralia. The condemnation required holdout residents to vacate. Residents challenged the condemnation in court, arguing that the state's interest was administrative, closing the books on a politically inconvenient situation, rather than grounded in an actual, present, evidence-based safety emergency that distinguished their properties from the surrounding condemned land. They argued that the danger levels they had been experiencing were no different from the danger levels they had been told for years were not emergency level. They argued that the condemnation was a tool for resolving a bureaucratic and political problem, not a safety measure. The litigation moved through Pennsylvania courts for 20 years. Some residents who had been party to the case died during those years. In 2013, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upheld the condemnation. The remaining residents, as a matter of law, had no legal right to occupy their homes. Pennsylvania did not remove them by force. In an agreement reached after the Supreme Court ruling, each remaining resident was permitted to live out their natural life in their home, after which the property would revert to state ownership. They would not be evicted while alive. They were given a terminal agreement: stay until you die, and then Centralia ends. The current population of Centralia, 5 to 10 people, varying by the source and the year, is almost entirely elderly. There are no children there. The agreement does not permit new residents. When the last of the people who accepted the lifetime arrangement dies, Pennsylvania will own all of Centralia, and the borough will exist as a legal entity presiding over empty land above a burning coal seam. The current population of Centralia, 5 to 10 people, varying by the source and the year, is almost entirely elderly. There are no children there. The agreement does not permit new residents. When the last of the people who accepted the lifetime arrangement dies, Pennsylvania will own all of Centralia, and the borough will exist as a legal entity presiding over empty land above a burning coal seam. What happens in the meantime is that Centralia has become, for a certain category of visitor, a destination. Not an official one. There is no interpretive center, no museum, no designated viewing area, no acknowledgement from the state that this is a place people come to see. But they come. Photographers come for the abandoned streets and the eerie quality of a town grid that is present but empty. Urban explorers come for the remaining structures and the sense of recent absence. Curious people come after reading about it online because the story of a town above a burning coal fire is legible and striking in a way that makes it shareable. On certain cold mornings, when atmospheric conditions are right, steam rises visibly from ground vents in several locations, and people photograph it. The photographs circulate. More people come. The remaining residents experience this as an intrusion. They are living in their homes, the same homes they have lived in for decades, and strangers drive slowly past and take photographs and sometimes approach them with questions. The state of Pennsylvania does not manage the visitor traffic. It does not particularly acknowledge it. The people who come to see the ghost town do not interact with any official structure, because there is no official structure left to interact with. They are visiting the absence of a town, and some of the town is still there, and the people who are still there are not exhibits. The St. Ignatius of Antioch Russian Orthodox Church still stands. The congregation of remaining residents still holds services. The church cemetery is maintained. The graves of people whose families left and will not return are still tended by the people who stayed. Pennsylvania Route 61, outside Centralia, includes a stretch that became known as the Graffiti Highway, a section of road that had been closed to vehicular traffic after the underground heat and surface subsidence made it structurally unsafe. For years after the road's closure, it became an informal destination. People drove to the barriers and walked in. They saw the cracked and heaved asphalt, the steam that rose from fissures on cold mornings, the weeds growing through breaks in the pavement. They left graffiti, layer upon layer, painting over what was there before, which is a different kind of memorial. The broken road was visible evidence of what lay beneath, an ordinary infrastructure object made strange and wrong by the fire below it. In April 2020, the property owner had the road covered with fill. Dump trucks brought material. The cracked surface and the cracks themselves were buried. The road became a smooth mound of earth. The graffiti is gone. The steam no longer rises where visitors could see it. The fire beneath the fill is unchanged. What happens to a place when it is removed from administrative existence, while still physically present, is a particular kind of erasure. Centralia has no zip code, but parcels there still have Columbia County addresses. It is not on official Pennsylvania municipal maps, but the borough remains a legal entity with an incorporated status, and technically an elected mayor from among the remaining residents. The street signs are still on the corners. The street grid, where it has not been reclaimed by vegetation or subsidized into irregularity, still corresponds to a plan that was laid out in the 1860s. The land records show the properties even as the properties are condemned. The town exists in a bureaucratic negative space, present physically and present legally, but absent from the systems that register civic existence. This did not happen accidentally. It is the aggregate result of specific decisions made over 6 decades. The decision to fund partial suppression instead of comprehensive suppression in 1963. The same decision made again in 1969, in 1977. The decision to communicate to residents a version of the monitoring results that did not fully reflect what the internal assessments showed. The decision in 1984 to fund relocation rather than the more expensive complete excavation. The decision to revoke the zip code. The decision to invoke eminent domain. Each of these decisions was made by identifiable institutions, often by identifiable individuals, and each was defensible in isolation. Together, they produced the erasure of a community. The fire beneath what used to be Centralia will burn for approximately 200 more years. This is not a dramatic projection. It is an engineering estimate based on the known distribution of coal in the connected mine workings and the documented spread rate of the fire. The estimate has been consistent across multiple assessments spanning several decades. The fire is not shrinking. It is not being suppressed. It is moving through underground passages at the pace that anthracite fires move, following fuel that is there because mining operations left it there, sustained by oxygen that moves through ventilation infrastructure that was designed to sustain life and now sustains combustion. No one who accepted the government's buyout in the 1980s is alive to see what the ground above the fire looks like now. The streets where they lived are empty lots. Some of the lots still show the rectangular outlines where foundations were. In some areas, the subsidence has disturbed even that. The town that existed before 1962, the churches, the school, the hotel, the fraternal halls, the baseball field, is mostly gone, demolished or collapsed or swallowed. What remains is a grid of roads with names, a few occupied houses, a church, a cemetery, and an underground fire that will still be burning when everyone alive today is dead. This is the road sign at the edge of what used to be a town in Pennsylvania. Centralia, population 0. The sign is inaccurate. A small number of people are still there. The sign is what the government wanted it to say. Eventually, when the last resident is gone, the government will be right. The previous video was about people who tried to stop disasters and were erased from the official story afterward. This is a video about a community that tried to stop its own erasure and was erased more slowly, more legally, more procedurally, but erased. The mechanism was not cruelty in the usual sense, it was calculation. At each decision point, someone in an office in Harrisburg or Washington ran the numbers and chose the option that cost less or that resolved the problem on the schedule that suited the institution. The cheaper option was never to fix the fire. The cheaper option was to wait for the people to leave. Some of them never did. Next video, a ship. Everyone with direct knowledge of it knew it would sink. The engineers who had built its predecessors had documented the failure mode and filed the documentation. The underwriters who insured it had flagged the risk category at the time of policy issuance. The operators had been informed before the vessel was launched. It sailed anyway. That is next.